You are standing in a quiet forest, pine needles falling gently, the air fresh and clean, and you have no idea that beneath your feet lie thousands of human skeletons. Not soldiers who died in battle, but people who were bound, shot in the back of the head, and buried like waste. This is not an ordinary mass killing, but a systematic decision, signed, carried out, and hidden for decades. And the most terrifying part is that those responsible did not just kill people, they also killed the truth. Today, we are going to explore the Katyn Massacre of 1943. April 1943, German forces entered a forest near Smolensk, a place where no one believed anything unusual existed beneath the cold soil. They were not searching for history, nor were they looking for evidence. They were simply digging trenches and reinforcing their positions in a war spreading across Europe. But then, their shovels struck something softer than the earth, and a foul smell began to rise from the ground. At first, they thought it was just dead animals or an old cemetery forgotten over time. But as the soil was cleared away, they saw boots, uniforms, and faces that had decomposed yet still carried their final expressions. Hundreds, then thousands of bodies, stacked on top of each other, as if they had been thrown there hastily, but with a clear system behind it. They all had one thing in common. Each had been shot once in the back of the head. There were no signs of resistance, no signs of battle, only the silence of a perfectly carried out execution. But to understand why they died, you must go back in time, to before the first shot echoed in the Katyn forest. You must return to 1939, when Europe was slowly sliding into a nightmare that no one could stop. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany attacked Poland from the west, marking the beginning of World War II. Just 16 days later, another force entered from the east, not to save Poland, but to divide it. The Soviet Union invaded Poland under the pretext of protection, but in reality, it was carrying out a secret agreement with Hitler. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not just a non-aggression agreement, but a map dividing Europe into parts that could be seized. Poland was trapped between two great powers and had no chance of surviving as an independent nation. Within a few weeks, Poland completely collapsed, and tens of thousands of soldiers, officers, and intellectuals were captured. But the Soviet Union did not just capture soldiers, they targeted Poland's leadership class, those capable of rebuilding the nation. Military officers, professors, doctors, lawyers, engineers, all were gathered like numbers on a list. They were not treated as ordinary prisoners of war, but as a potential threat to the system. And in Stalin's eyes, a potential threat had to be eliminated before it could become reality. These people were sent to different prison camps scattered across Soviet territory. Camps such as Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov became places where thousands of Poles were detained. They were not immediately tortured, nor immediately killed, but kept in a state of uncertainty. Some believed they would be exchanged as prisoners of war or released after the war. Others began to suspect something was wrong, but still held on to hope because no one could imagine what was being prepared for them. In the camps, they maintained their old habits, writing diaries, praying, and trying to preserve their dignity. They did not know that in Moscow, a decision had already been made, and their names were already on a list of execution. On March 5, 1940, Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, sent a memorandum to Stalin. In it, he proposed the execution of more than 25,000 Polish prisoners, those considered beyond reform. Stalin did not hesitate, did not request a trial, did not require evidence, he simply signed. With a single signature, thousands of people were sentenced to death without ever knowing. There were no courts, no lawyers, no defense, only a cold administrative decision. And from that moment on, the camps were no longer places of detention, but waiting stations for death. From April 1940, prisoners began to be called out in small groups. They were told they would be transferred, perhaps to another location, perhaps to be released. They were instructed to bring their personal belongings, creating the illusion that they were leaving, not heading toward death. This was not accidental, but part of the plan, to prevent panic and resistance. At Kozelsk camp, Those selected were loaded onto trucks and transported to the Katyn forest. They did not know that it would be the final destination of their lives. Upon arrival, they were led into a small building, one by one, as if going through administrative procedures. But inside, there were no documents, no desks, only a room and a gun. Each person had their hands tied behind their back, then was led into a closed room. A bullet was fired into the back of the head at close range, ensuring instant death. Their bodies were dragged outside and thrown into pits that had been prepared in advance. Then the next person stepped in, and the process repeated, precise, cold, without error. There were no loud screams, no chaos, only the sound of gunfire and bodies hitting the ground. A killing process operated like a machine, where human beings were merely input material. And the most terrifying part was that those carrying this out were not insane. They were people working under orders, following procedures, executing a plan approved at the highest level. Within a few weeks, thousands were killed and buried in mass graves. Katyn was only one of several locations. Others included Kalinin, Kharkiv, and many more. In total, more than 22,000 Poles were executed in this operation. But the story did not end there. Because after killing them, the Soviet Union did not just bury the bodies, they buried the truth as well. When the first bodies were unearthed in the Katyn forest, the Germans did not just see death, they saw an opportunity not to save lives, but to use death as a weapon in a larger war. War is not only fought with weapons, but also with narratives, with the control and distortion of truth. And Katyn, with its thousands of bodies, became a perfect weapon for that purpose. Immediately after the discovery, German forces quickly sealed off the area, allowing no one to approach without control. They did not rush to announce it right away, because they understood that this information needed to be used at the right moment for maximum impact. Meanwhile, forensic experts began their work, digging layer by layer, documenting every detail, every trace that remained. They observed that the bodies were all dressed in Polish military uniforms, and many still carried documents, letters, and personal belongings. Notably, all of these materials stopped around early 1940, with nothing dated later than that. This raised a critical question. If they had died after the Germans occupied the area, why was there no evidence from after 1940? Forensic doctors also determined that the level of decomposition was consistent with the victims having died about 3 years earlier. That is, around 1940, when the area was still under Soviet control. This was not speculation, but a conclusion based on science, grounded in physical evidence that could not easily be altered. But in war, the truth is not always as important as who tells the story. On April 13, 1943, Nazi Germany officially announced to the world the discovery of mass graves at Katyn. They accused the Soviet Union of carrying out the massacre, presenting evidence from their initial examinations. German radio broadcasts spread the information continuously. Newspapers published images, and Katyn became global news. But remember, this was Nazi Germany, a regime not unfamiliar with manipulating information and staging narratives. So the world could not simply believe them, even if what they said seemed logical. To strengthen their credibility, Germany invited an international commission of forensic experts from several European countries to investigate. This commission included doctors from countries such as Hungary, Italy, Switzerland, and others not directly involved in the war. They conducted independent examinations, analyzed the bodies, and reviewed the evidence at the site. Their conclusions largely matched the initial findings. The victims had been killed in the spring of 1940. This indicated that the massacre occurred while the area was still under Soviet control. Germany quickly used this conclusion as evidence to reinforce their accusations on the international stage. They not only wanted to expose the Soviet Union, but also to fracture the alliance between the Soviets and the Allied powers. And this is where the story becomes more complex, because the truth was now drawn into another kind of war, the war of information. The Polish government in exile in London, upon hearing about Katyn, immediately called for an independent international investigation. They did not trust Germany, but they could not ignore the evidence and testimonies from the site. They requested that the International Red Cross step in to verify the truth objectively. This was a reasonable move, but it triggered a fierce reaction from the Soviet Union. Stalin not only completely denied the accusations, but turned them around, blaming Germany instead. According to the Soviet version, Polish officers had been captured by Germany after 1941, and it was the Germans who killed them and blamed the Soviets. A completely contradictory narrative, yet delivered with absolute confidence and no sign of hesitation. And then, the Soviet Union went one step further. They severed diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile, simply because Poland dared to request an investigation. Pause for a moment and think about that. A wartime ally was cut off, just for wanting to know the truth about thousands of its own citizens. This shows that Katyn was not only a massacre, but also a fracture within the anti-fascist alliance. Western countries, especially Britain and the United States, found themselves in an extremely difficult position. They needed the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany, but they also could not completely ignore the evidence surrounding Katyn. Winston Churchill knew that something was wrong, but he also understood that confronting Stalin at that moment was impossible. Franklin Roosevelt was in a similar position, forced to balance morality and strategy. And in the end, they chose silence. Not because they believed the Soviet Union, but because they had no other choice in the context of war. Katyn became a suspended truth, unrecognized, yet impossible to completely erase. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union began constructing its own narrative, a tightly controlled version of history. They established their own investigative commission in 1944, after retaking the area from Germany. This commission, of course, concluded that Germany was responsible and that the victims had been killed in 1941. A conclusion completely contradicting earlier evidence, yet presented as official truth. And because the Soviet Union was one of the victors of the war, their version carried greater weight. Not because it was true, but because they had the power to make it truth. At the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi war crimes were prosecuted, the Soviet Union even attempted to include Katyn as a German crime. But this time, the judges were not fully convinced, and Katyn was not officially concluded in the final verdict. However, that did not change the reality that for decades, the Soviet version continued to be taught and believed. The truth was buried, not only beneath the ground, but beneath layers of controlled and distorted information. And the families of the victims, those who lost fathers, husbands, and brothers, received no answers. Only silence or lies repeated long enough to become official truth. But the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, has a dangerous characteristic. It does not disappear. And one day it will return, not through words, but through undeniable evidence. After the war ended, the world believed that the truth would be revealed, that crimes would be called by their rightful names. But with Katyn, the opposite happened, because the victors had the power to rewrite history as they wished. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, with enough prestige and influence to shape the global narrative. And they used that power not only to build the future, but to bury the past. Katyn was no longer an open question, but became an official truth within the Soviet system. According to that version, Nazi Germany was the perpetrator, and any doubt was considered hostile propaganda. There was no room for debate, no room for independent investigation, only a single narrative allowed to exist. In schools, in newspapers, in all official documents, Katyn was described as a German crime. Anyone who dared to question it was not only considered wrong, but dangerous. Because in such a system, truth is not just information, it is a threat. In Poland, the situation was even more complicated, as the country fell within the Soviet sphere of influence after the war. The new Polish government was forced to follow the historical narrative dictated by Moscow. That meant Polish people had to accept that their fathers and brothers had been killed by Germany, not the Soviet Union. Even if they knew it was not true, they were not allowed to say it. The families of the victims lived in a strange state where they knew the truth but could not speak it publicly. They whispered to each other at home, but remained silent in public. Some tried to seek information, writing letters, asking the authorities, but the answers were always the same. No information, or worse, vague and contradictory explanations. Meanwhile, in the West, Katyn became a sensitive topic, not because of a lack of information, but because of too much political risk. After the war, the Soviet Union was no longer a temporary ally, but became an opponent in the Cold War. This opened the door for the West to re-examine what had previously been overlooked. In 1951, the U.S. Congress established a special committee to investigate the Katyn Massacre. This committee, known as the Madden Committee, began gathering evidence and testimonies from various sources. They interviewed witnesses, examined documents, and analyzed forensic reports from both sides. And gradually, a clear picture began to emerge. The committee's conclusion was clear: the Soviet Union was responsible for the Katyn Massacre. This was not propaganda, but the result of a systematic investigation. But this conclusion did not lead to concrete action because the Cold War was at a tense stage. The United States did not want to escalate tensions by directly confronting the Soviet Union over this issue. Once again, Katyn was caught between truth and politics. In the following years, documents and evidence continued to surface, but not enough to break the wall of silence. Some former Soviet officials who defected to the West began to speak about what they knew. They spoke about the NKVD, about the prison camps, about execution orders signed at the highest level. But their testimonies were often doubted or dismissed as propaganda in the context of the Cold War. The truth still existed, but it was not strong enough to become official truth globally. Within the Soviet Union, the files on Katyn were kept sealed, with only a very small number of people in the system knowing the full truth. These documents were not allowed to leave the archives nor to be made public. This was not just concealment, but total control over collective memory. The next generation grew up knowing nothing about Katyn, or only a distorted version of it. They believed what they were taught, because they had no way to verify it. But time has a characteristic that no system can fully control. It reveals cracks. In the 1970s and 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to show signs of weakening, some voices started to emerge. Historians, writers, and activists began to question events of the past. Katyn gradually returned as an unanswered question. It was no longer openly discussed, but it was no longer completely forgotten. And then, something happened that no one in the old system could stop. The files began to leak. Not all at once, not immediately, but enough to create doubt. Internal documents, notes, and orders began to appear outside. One of the most important documents was Beria's memorandum to Stalin in 1940. In it, he proposed the execution of thousands of Polish prisoners. And more importantly, the document bore Stalin's signature. This was no longer testimony, no longer speculation, but direct evidence from the center of power. As these documents became known, the story of Katyn could no longer be controlled as before. The truth was no longer a rumor, but something that could not be completely denied. But even then, the response remained slow, because acknowledging the truth meant admitting a major crime. And for a system that had built its identity on victory and righteousness, that was not easy. But the wheel of history had begun to turn, and it could not be stopped. Katyn, once buried beneath the ground and beneath layers of lies, was slowly rising to the surface. And this time, it was not just a story, but evidence. Evidence that truth can be delayed, but never destroyed. For decades, Katyn existed like a ghost, not gone, yet never officially acknowledged. A wound that was never healed, only covered by layers of lies and silence. But by the late 1980s, something began to change. Not from the outside, but from within the Soviet Union itself. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power with a dangerous promise: reform, transparency, and openness. These words sounded positive, but for a system built on control, they were a threat. The policy of glasnost, meaning openness, opened the door to questions that no one had dared to ask before. And Katyn was one of the biggest questions. The pressure came not only from the outside, but also from the people of Poland and the Soviet Union themselves. They wanted to know what had really happened to the thousands who had disappeared. Historians, journalists, and the families of victims began to speak out more strongly. They no longer accepted vague answers or official narratives. And for the first time, the Soviet government could no longer simply silence these voices as it had before. In 1990, a turning point occurred. The Soviet Union officially admitted that the NKVD had carried out the Katyn Massacre. Not Nazi Germany, not a misunderstanding, but themselves. This was the first time in history that a superpower openly admitted to a crime it had denied for nearly half a century. But the truth did not come as a full apology. It came as a controlled admission, a cautious step in a difficult process. However, for the families of the victims, it was a historic moment. Not because they had just learned the truth, but because the world finally knew. But the story did not end there. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian President Boris Yeltsin released classified documents. These documents did not only confirm the crime, but also revealed who had ordered it. Among them was Beria's memorandum proposing the execution of thousands of Polish prisoners. And beneath it was Stalin's signature. There was no longer room for doubt, no space for debate. This was direct evidence from the center of Soviet power. Katyn was no longer a mystery, but a proven truth. But this truth carried an immense weight. Because it was not only about the deaths of 22,000 people, it was about a system capable of mass killing, then concealing and denying it for decades. It showed how power could control not only the present, but also the past. And it raised an uncomfortable question. If Katyn could be hidden for so long, how many other Katyns are there that we still do not know? For Poland, this acknowledgement was both a victory and a pain. A victory because the truth was recognized, but painful because it came too late. Many had died without ever knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Many families spent their entire lives in uncertainty and doubt. And even when the truth was revealed, justice remained an unanswered question. There were no major trials, no sentences proportionate to the crime. Only acknowledgement, and a history that had to be rewritten. Some investigations were opened, but many records remained sealed or restricted. Some of those responsible had long since died, taking their answers to the grave. Katyn became a symbol, not only of a massacre, but of how truth can be distorted. It also became a reminder that history is not always what is taught in books. In the years that followed, memorials were built and commemorations were held. The names of the victims were read aloud, one by one, as a way of restoring their identities. But no memorial can fully compensate for what was lost. No apology can erase decades of denial. And there are still controversies. Some documents remain undisclosed, some questions remain unanswered. Katyn, even though acknowledged, has not truly ended. Because truth is not just about knowing what happened, it is about accepting it, confronting it, and learning from it. And that is the hardest part. There is something more terrifying than killing 22,000 people in silence. It is making the entire world believe a lie for nearly half a century. Katyn is not just a massacre, it is a test of humanity's memory, and we almost failed it. After the truth was revealed, many believed the story had ended. That once history was corrected, justice would automatically follow. But history does not work that way. Truth can be acknowledged, but justice does not always follow. The families of the victims did not just lose their loved ones. They lost decades of their lives to uncertainty, to false answers. Imagine living your entire life not knowing how your father died. And then, when you finally learn the truth, you realize he did not die in war, but was executed like a number. And worse, you realize it was deliberately hidden. That is not just loss, it is a form of violence that stretches across generations. Children grew up with unanswered questions. Families learned to stay silent because speaking out could be dangerous. That silence became a legacy, passed from one generation to the next. But then, when the truth was revealed, a new question emerged. What do we do with this truth? Not everyone wants to answer that question. Some prefer to close this chapter, to treat it as a mistake of the past. But Katyn does not belong only to the past. It is a warning for the present. Because what happened at Katyn did not begin with guns. It began with a decision. A decision that a group of people no longer had value. A decision that truth could be controlled. And once those decisions are accepted, the rest is just process. A list is made, an order is signed, names are called, and then they disappear. What is terrifying is not the chaos. What is terrifying is the order in killing. Everything was carried out neatly, efficiently, and without leaving immediate traces. Katyn was not an outbreak of violence. It was the result of a system functioning exactly as it was designed. And that is the biggest twist of this story. Those who carried it out did not see themselves as killers. They believed they were simply doing their job. They followed orders, they completed their tasks, and then they went home. No emotions, no questions, only procedure. And for many years after, they lived as ordinary people. That is what makes Katyn more terrifying than any horror film. Because it shows that evil does not need to look frightening, it only needs to be legalized. And once it is legalized, it can exist without being challenged. Katyn also reveals something else. Truth does not always prevail immediately. It can be buried, distorted, denied for decades. But it does not disappear. It waits, waiting for those brave enough to search for it. Waiting for evidence strong enough that it cannot be denied. And when it returns, it brings with it everything that was hidden. The names, the stories, the deaths. Katyn teaches us that remembering is not just an act of history, it is an act of justice. Every time a name is spoken, a part of the truth is restored. Every time a story is told, a lie is weakened. But memory can also be erased if we do not protect it. And that is why stories like Katyn must be told. Not to nurture hatred, but to prevent repetition. Because the world once believed Katyn was an isolated event, but history shows it is not unique. It is part of a larger pattern where unchecked power leads to catastrophe, and if we do not learn from it, we will repeat it in different forms. Maybe not in Katyn, maybe not in a forest, but somewhere when similar conditions appear. A list will be made, an order will be signed, and someone will disappear again. So the final question is not, what is Katyn, but what have we learned from Katyn? And more importantly, have we truly learned? Because if the answer is no, then Katyn has never ended. It is only waiting for the next time. Thank you for listening to the full story, and don't forget to like and subscribe to see more videos.